We moved into a mansion in Mexico, not knowing that it was built on a cursed piece of land. Before long, the shadows stalked us, and the house became our prison, destroying us one by one. The Vargas family was always known in the town for its wealth and power. They lived in a huge mansion located on the edge of the village, right on the hills that dominated the landscape. The patriarch, Don Manuel Vargas, was a shrewd and respected businessman, owner of several plantations and a network of companies that guaranteed him prosperity. His wife, Dona Catalina, was an elegant woman, always fashionable, and the mother of 3 children: Lucia, an 18-year-old girl; Eduardo, a 16-year-old teenager; and Sofia, the 8-year-old girl. The Vargas mansion was an imposing building of colonial architecture, with high ceilings, large windows, and a fence that surrounded the entire property, which gave it an even more majestic appearance. However, for many, the house also had an unsettling atmosphere. Some neighbors said that not only the opulence of the family caused distrust, but also the strange number of employees who passed through the house.
If you like this video, stay until the end, like, subscribe, and activate the bell for more videos.
And above all, the feeling that something in its hallways was not right. It was a summer night when the first strange incidents began. Lucia, who at that time was returning from university in the city, was the first to notice something strange. Upon reaching his room, the light flickered several times before turning off completely. Confused, she thought that the light bulb had simply failed, but what bothered her most was the feeling that something was watching her from the darkness. He decided to ignore it, thinking that the fatigue of his long journey had altered his perception. However, that same night, at bedtime, he heard strange noises coming from the hallway, as if someone was walking on the old wooden floorboards. He got up to investigate, but found nothing, only the distant echo of a door closing. The next morning, she told her mother what had happened, but Dona Catalina played it down, assuring her that perhaps they were noises from the house, so old and full of history. "Nothing but the creaking of wood, daughter," he said in a calm tone. But Lucia was not so sure. That same night, the noise in the hallway was repeated. This time, however, something was different. The footsteps seemed to increase in intensity, as if someone were walking quickly to his room. Frightened, Lucia closed the door tightly and hugged her pillow, trying to calm her breathing. The sound ceased, but a shadow passed under his door. It was so subtle that, at first, he thought it was a figment of his imagination. But then, a strange pressure on his chest made him open his eyes. The shadow not only passed under the door, but seemed to move, gliding as if it had a life of its own. Lucia, paralyzed with fear, tried to call her mother, but something stopped her. The feeling that there was something more, something dark, in the house, was getting stronger and stronger. When he finally dared to leave his room, the house was quiet, but there was something in the air that he couldn't identify. The discovery of a small object, a rusty metal that appeared to have been on the floor for a long time, only worsened the sense of unease. How did he get there? No one seemed to know. Don Manuel, though initially skeptical, began to hear his children talk about the strange experiences. The next afternoon, he summoned a couple of employees who had worked with them for years, asking them to check the house to make sure there weren't any electrical problems or any leaks in the pipes that could cause strange noises. But none of the employees, after a thorough review, found anything out of the ordinary. The problem, however, did not stop. That same evening, after dinner, Eduardo, the eldest son, was in the living room when he noticed a flash in the large mirror that decorated the wall. At first, I thought it was a reflection of light, but upon closer look, he clearly saw the figure of a person standing behind him, staring at the window. He turned quickly, but no one was there. The room was empty, though he couldn't help but feel a chill run down his spine. He approached the mirror, observed his reflection, but again, There was something in the glass that he could not see clearly. It seemed as if a shadow slipped behind him. Eduardo, disturbed, decided not to tell anyone, fearing that they would take him for crazy. However, as the days went by, she began to notice other disturbing details. During the night, I felt as if something was watching him as he slept. It was as if the air in his room was thick and heavy, and a cold sweat was accumulating on his forehead for no apparent reason. I couldn't stop thinking about that shadow in the mirror, as if it were a warning of something bigger that was about to happen. One afternoon, while the Vargas family was gathered in the living room, one of the servants, Teresa, rushed in, her face pale and frightened. "Ma'am, gentlemen," he began, "there's something strange about the shed at the back of the property. I don't dare go alone." Everyone at the table was silent, looking at each other. The expression on the face of Teresa, a woman who had been working for the family for years, made the concern increase. What could he have seen in the shed? Don Manuel got up from the table and, accompanied by some of the employees, went to the shed. The sun was already beginning to set, and darkness began to envelop the mansion. When they reached the shed, the door was ajar. When they opened it completely, what they found left everyone speechless. Inside were a series of ancient objects, and in the center, a wooden table covered with strange, almost illegible symbols. Some of these symbols resembled those seen in occult books, and a feeling of intense cold filled the air. Don Manuel, seeing this, stood still, as if he recognized what was in front of him. However, before he could say anything, a strong gust of wind slammed the door shut. The sound of the employees' hurried footsteps grew louder as they tried to open the door, but it was stuck. In the end, only Teresa, visibly terrified, was able to run out to the house, screaming for help. What followed that night would forever change the lives of the Vargas family. The darkness surrounding the mansion no longer seemed to be normal. Something much deeper and more dangerous was in the game. The night following the incident in the shed was fraught with tension. The Vargas family couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. No one dared to return near the shed, and the atmosphere in the mansion became heavy, as if the air was impregnated with a bad omen. The feeling that something was watching them, something that I could not see but could feel, became more and more intense. Lucia, unable to sleep, decided to take a night walk around the mansion to calm her thoughts. He walked through the empty corridors, and as he passed through the living room, he noticed something strange. The old velvet curtains moved by themselves, as if an invisible breeze were pushing them away. The wind was closed in that part of the house, but the curtains moved in an almost hypnotic rhythm, as if someone were touching them. She approached, fearful, and when she touched them, a cold discharge ran through her. A whisper, like a distant murmur, reached his ears. He turned quickly, but there was nothing, only the empty echo of the mansion. That same night, Eduardo couldn't help but hear footsteps in the hallway again. This time they were clearer, as if someone was walking back and forth, moving forward and stopping in front of the doors of the rooms. He decided to get up and, armed with a flashlight, went out into the hallway to investigate. As he went, a strange chill enveloped him, and every time he pointed the flashlight towards the end of the hallway, he felt as if something was waiting for him there. When he finally arrived in front of Lucia's room, the door was ajar. A look inside revealed the shadow of a figure in the background. He thought that perhaps Lucia had fallen asleep with the light on, but as he approached, he saw that the figure was not standing, but floating, suspended in the air. It was at that moment that fear paralyzed him. He tried to scream, but his throat was closed, as if an invisible force was choking him. He could only watch as the shadow slowly faded, as if disintegrating into thin air. With his heart racing, Eduardo ran out of the house, seeking refuge in the garden. The cool night air allowed him to breathe hard, but all he could think about was what he had seen, what he should not have seen. The next day, the family gathers in the dining room, more tense than ever. No one had slept well, and fear was beginning to cloud his thoughts. Despite his doubts, Don Manuel decided to call an expert, someone who could help him understand what was happening in his house. He called an acquaintance, Father Joseph, a priest who had been called on previous occasions to deal with unusual cases. At first, Don Manuel thought that all this could be a product of the imagination or of collective fear, but as the strange experiences increased, he could no longer ignore what was happening. Father Joseph arrived in the afternoon, accompanied by some religious objects and a serious, if somewhat skeptical, attitude. The priest began walking around the house, touching the walls, whispering prayers, and sprinkling holy water in the rooms. However, as he walked around the mansion, his gestures changed. As he approached Lucia's room, his face hardened, and an expression of horror began to form on his lips. "Here it is," he muttered, almost to himself, before running off to the back shed. Don Manuel followed quickly, his face now visibly worried. Father Joseph stopped in front of the shed door and, in an impulsive act, pushed it open. Instantly, a cloud of cold air shot out from within, as if an invisible force had been contained there all along. The priest paused and, in a trembling voice, said, "Whatever is causing all this is not of this world. It's something much older, and its influence on this house is stronger than we imagine." That night, Father Joseph celebrated Mass at the mansion, seeking to expel what he believed to be an evil spirit. During the ceremony, members of the Vargas family were visibly disturbed, but what happened at the end of the Mass took their breath away. As he prayed the last words, an explosion of noise swept through the mansion. The lights flickered violently, and the ground shook as if an earthquake had shaken the house. The figure of a dark shadow appeared in front of them, floating above the altar, looking at the family with empty, piercing eyes. It was as if they were in front of a being that did not belong to this world, a presence that he had been guarding for years, perhaps centuries, to take possession of the Vargas mansion. The shadow began to move, sliding towards Don Manuel, who tried to back up, but his feet seemed to be nailed to the ground. Father Joseph, visibly terrified, tried to recite the last prayers in a trembling voice, but every word seemed to be absorbed by the darkness around them. The family members, paralyzed by fear, did not know what to do. Suddenly, the shadow vanished, leaving only a dense and heavy air. The house, suddenly, was in absolute silence. No one dared to speak, but everyone knew that something much darker had awakened within the walls of the Vargas mansion. Something that would not leave them in peace until everything was consumed by his presence. The terror that seized the Vargas family had no name. After the shadow disappeared, the house was silent, but the air was still thick, as if something was constantly watching them. Father Jose, visibly exhausted, insisted that he leave the mansion, but Don Manuel, despite his fear, refused. "This is our heritage," he said firmly. "We're not going to give in to the unknown." However, the family knew that the fight was just beginning. That night, events escalated. Lucia, terrified by what she had experienced, spent the night with the lights on, not daring to close her eyes. The strange noises returned, footsteps, whispers, the creaking of doors, but this time they weren't just sounds. The objects began to move on their own. The chairs in the living room moved freely, without anyone touching them. The doors slammed shut, as if an invisible hand were pushing them furiously. Lucia, unable to resist any longer, ran to the shed, convinced that this was the key to everything that was happening. When I arrived, I found something I would never forget. On the ground, covered by a layer of dust, lay an ancient object, almost buried among broken woods, a book with yellowed pages, covered by a strange symbol, like a circle with engraved runes. Trembling, Lucia recognized it and, with growing fear, opened it. The words written in the language I couldn't understand moved on their own, as if the book were alive. Suddenly, a low, macabre laugh filled the shed, and Lucia felt something touch her. The book was violently closed, and a sense of utter evil pervaded the place. That same day, Father Jose returned to the mansion. This time, however, his face was more serious than ever. "There is something in this place," he said in a deep voice, "something that cannot be expelled by simple prayers." He had found the key in the old church archives, and what he discovered was even more terrifying. The Vargas mansion, according to ancient accounts, had been built on a cursed piece of land, a place where ancient dark magic practices had been carried out in time immemorial. The symbol in the book that Lucia had found was nothing more than an indication of something much greater and more powerful than any human being could imagine. That presence had been waiting, trapped between dimensions, until, by mistake or fate, the Vargas family had unearthed what should never have been released. From that moment on, terror was unleashed with all its force. Family members began to experience disturbing visions. Eduardo saw the figure of a girl with empty eyes looking at her from the mirrors of the mansion. Rosa, Don Manuel's wife, often heard whispers calling her by name, their voices silky and familiar, but with a tone so dark that it made her feel as if someone was trying to rip her soul out. The youngest daughter, Mariana, began to talk about a lady in white who visited her every night, a being who called her to the garden, always at the same time, as if he were waiting to take her away. Increasingly trapped, the Vargas began to look for a way out. Attempts to break the cycle of evil through purification rites only increased the violence of the phenomena. Father Jose, in desperation, tried once again to persuade them to leave the mansion, but Don Manuel refused, clinging to the idea that the family should fight to recover what was theirs. Thus, the struggle to survive the clutches of the unknown intensified. The family's last attempt to free the house came when Don Manuel, along with Father Jose, tried to perform an ancient ritual to seal off the evil presence. They prepared everything, gathering the materials, and, with great effort, began to recite the words of an incantation that came from ancient times. But when they reached the final part of the ritual, the ground shook with such force that it almost fell to the ground. The lights flickered again, and a laugh that doesn't belong in this world enveloped them. Something had gone wrong. At that precise moment, the book that Lucia had found opened again, this time with an almost supernatural force. The pages began to turn rapidly, and the symbol on the cover glowed with a dark light, as if a door was opening between dimensions. The presence, which had been lurking for so long, had finally achieved its freedom. The Vargas family was dragged into the darkness emanating from the house, and the mansion fell silent. No one else saw her again. No one dared to approach her. Today, the mansion is said to still stand, hidden in fog and neglect, like an echo of the past. Some have tried to get closer, but never returned. The few who dare to talk about it say that, on moonless nights, you can hear the lament of the lost souls, trapped between the walls of a house that should never have been inhabited. The Vargas family disappeared, leaving only a dark legend about the cursed mansion, and a book still kept by its next reader.